Hello everyone, JG1 Barton here with a P-40 tutorial. I love flying this plane, and you should too. However, this plane isn't exactly easy to fly. It will punish you if you don't get it right, and it's very, very particular about the way it likes to be treated. So, it's really hard for new people to learn because most new people are very impatient, and this plane absolutely hates people who are impatient. So, I decided to do a tutorial to make sure that everyone can treat this aircraft right without having to go through the trial and errors that I had to learn. We'll go over the instrument panel as well as the throttle quadrant, and then we'll go over taxiing and takeoff procedures, some tips and hints that I like to use. Then we'll go over engine management and flight as well as the altimeter, which I'll explain a little bit later. And then we'll do our landing, which is really easy, and that will wrap up this video. So, starting with the instrument panel, working top to bottom and left to right, we have our magnetic compass. This is marked every 5 degrees and labeled every 10, with 21 being 210 degrees. So, add a 0 to every label that you see here, and that will give you your heading in degrees. Moving on to the right, we have our artificial horizon. This gives you your bank and pitch attitude. On the second row, we have our fuel gauge. Full is 52 gallons. 0 is glide mode. Tried to get home before then. Airspeed is in miles per hour. Every 50 miles an hour is 80 kilometers an hour. I find that little tidbit of information to be quite useful when converting airspeed between miles per hour and kilometers an hour, especially between miles per hour and kilometers an hour, 2 kilometers per hour, as you will have to do in this aircraft. If you are used to kilometers an hour because your country is either sensible and uses the metric system, or you just fly Russian or German planes a lot, then you're used to kilometers an hour as an airspeed measurement. So 50 here is 80 kilometers an hour, then 160, and so on and so on. Our airspeed indicator goes all the way up to 500 miles per hour. You can go a little bit faster than that. So this thing's a tank and a dive. I wouldn't worry about it. Next is our turn bank indicator with our slip ball. Keep the ball between the lines to keep this thing as slick as possible, to keep it out of a slide or a slip. And if that needle is to the left or to the right of the center, you are in a left or right hand turn. The next one is the vertical speed indicator. It is marked off in hundreds of feet per minute, between 0 and 1,000 feet per minute. And it is marked off every 500 feet per minute, thereafter up to 6,000 feet per minute. Our next gauge is going to be our manifold pressure. We'll go over that with engine management. Suction, useless, don't worry about it. Coolant temperature, keep it below the red mark, in between the green ones. Pretty good advice. Next, we have our flap and gear indicator, not indicating the correct gear position because the power is off. Our clock, self-explanatory. Our altimeter, which I said I'll go over when we're in the air. And this is the compass that will be useful to us in combat. This one isn't as accurate as our first compass. However, if you're in a turn fight, this one will still give you your direction, unlike the other one. So, this one's useful for navigating. This one's useful in combat, or in a situation where you're having to maneuver. This is your tachometer. It reads RPM for the motor. Keep it under that second green mark for continuous mode. Anything above that is combat power. This thing will do 3,000 RPM at 100% prop pitch. However, if you are using sudden throttle movements, you can overspeed the engine temporarily. So be aware of that. And next is our oil temperature sensor, or our oil temperature indicator in centigrade. Keep it below the red line, typically right around the green line. and it also has our oil and fuel pressure gauges in pounds. So that will be fairly important to keep your eye on if you have a damaged engine. Let you know if you have oil or fuel pressure problems. Now moving on to the throttle quadrant. We have our throttle. It's pretty self-explanatory. Everyone should know about that. Our mixture, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you have this. This isn't needed. The engine startup procedure will set this to auto rich, and you really don't need to move it from there ever, unless you need to either shut the engine off with the auto cutoff or put it to auto lean to conserve fuel. 99% of the time this is going to be an auto rich, and it gets set there after your engine start procedure. So if you have mixture set, don't worry about it. It's going to be the least of your concerns. You should have prop pitch set to something that you can adjust it, because that's going to be very important in this plane. So moving on from there, we'll start talking about taxiing after we get the engine started, and the engine startup procedure is quite long, so I'll go ahead and skip that, and we'll see you guys once this baby's running. Alright, welcome back, and now that we've got this Allison engine ready to go, let's go ahead and start our taxiing. We're going to use 0 flap shutter, or radiator shutters, because we don't need them. The engine is cool enough that we won't need it for taxiing. We're not going to overheat. However, this is something you're going to have to keep your eyes on. Typically about 10% is good for a takeoff roll and our climb out initially, although you'll have to adjust that as you go. For now, 0% radiator shutters. We'll go ahead and remove our parking brake and increase our throttle just a little bit until we start moving, and then we'll reduce our throttle to maintain our speed. We can use our rudder to turn the aircraft, although it will behoove you to be quite cautious when using the rudder to turn the plane, as the tail likes to pick up speed and hold on to it a lot. And if you get the tail end moving too quickly, you'll find yourself chasing it in a ground loop, or 2 or 3, depending on how much speed you've got. And the brakes, although they work, they do not work well enough to prevent or really stop this in any useful amount of time. So be careful, be patient. If you have to taxi at a higher speed, use your toe brakes and use differential braking. The brakes are effective, but they're not going to whip you around like they do in other planes. So if you need to use a little bit higher taxiing speed, use just the toe brakes, and if you need a little bit more turn than your toe brakes can give you, use a little bit of rudder. But don't use too much, because you'll be spinning like a top. And we'll weave back and forth to make sure that we can see in front of us, although there really isn't anyone. There's no one in front of us. This is a quick mission. There's no one else here. So the tip to taxiing is do so at a deliberate and safe speed, and don't over control it when you're going into a turn like this. It's like, oh hey, we just tried to make a turn and we're dragging our wing across the ground. It's quite easy. All I did was kick the rudder. I didn't even have to continue holding the rudder down at all. As soon as it started swinging to the right, the tail grabbed and went with it, and it went around. So here I'm going to try and get back up to speed again, and I'll just kick the rudder and then try and save it, and I'll see how effective that is. And get up to speed, and kick the rudder and a little bit of brake, and now opposite, and nothing. Practically useless. So the best way is just to go slow, use slight and deliberate adjustments with your rudder controls. You need to augment your brakes. You're going to taxi with the brakes for the most part. Now, I'm going to go ahead and skip to the runway, and we'll do our takeoff procedure. Alright, now that we've managed to get to the runway, we'll go ahead and do our pre-takeoff adjustments. Our first adjustment that I suggest you make is increasing your your pitch trim to 80%. You can use a little bit of flap if you want, but I don't. I would suggest using 85% prop pitch, because that will alleviate one of the problems with using 100% prop pitch that I will show you, because that's what I'm going to use for this takeoff roll. We go ahead and set our parking brake, and we will set our cowl shutters at 10% just so we have some cooling and we don't forget during our climb out. So we're going to go ahead and set our manifold pressure up to about 30, and then we'll release the brake, and then we'll continue up to 40 inches of mercury. And the engine RPM is going to come up and it'll settle around 2700 RPM. But as the aircraft begins to increase in its speed, the prop pitch will be thin enough that the engine RPM will start to climb, and it will eventually reach 3000 RPM. And if you don't adjust your throttle during the takeoff roll, your manifold pressure will increase throughout that. So if we set our initial manifold pressure at 40 inches of mercury, eventually by the time we take off it will be somewhere near 44 inches of mercury. So if you set this at 45 inches of mercury with 100% prop pitch when you take off, by the time you get to the point where you're going to rotate, you're going to be so over boosted that you'll probably blow your engine before you get up into the air. So here we go, 30 inches of mercury, parking brake off, through to 40, and set there. I'm not going to touch the throttle for the rest of the takeoff roll. Watch as our RPM increases, so will the manifold pressure. Using a little bit of right rudder to keep the thing going straight down the runway. We're going to use a little bit of forward stick to get the nose down and the tail up, reduce our drag for our takeoff roll, increasing our speed to 120 miles per hour, pulling back and taking off. As we climb out, we're going to decrease our prop pitch to 70% and reduce our manifold pressure to 37.5 inches of mercury, and that will give us a good constant power rating. Now we can look at our altimeter. The long hand reads in hundreds of feet. The middle hand at the moment, which is the bigger small hand, reads in thousands of feet. So we are currently between 14 and 1500 feet indicated altitude, and the smaller hand reads tens of thousands of feet. So if we were at 11,000 feet, that smaller hand would be in between the 1 and the 2 instead of in between the 0 and the 1. We're going to come back to the left and stay over the airfield. I haven't touched the throttle at all, and yet you might notice that we've lost a little bit of manifold pressure, and that's something you need to keep your eye on when you're climbing, because like I stated before, our manifold pressure is not regulated, and it will fall as we climb, and it will climb as we fall. So if you're in a dive chasing an enemy plane, you actually have to pull back on the throttle to make sure you don't overboost the engine. And as you climb, you have to steadily increase your throttle to maintain your manifold pressure. Now that we're at 3,500 feet, go ahead and level out here. If we keep our speed up, we don't really have to worry about our radiator flaps. I run sometimes down to 5% with no problems. Especially in winter maps, you can pretty much run them closed. without any issues. Unless you get into some heavy combat, in which case about 10% will probably do. The most you'll ever really need is about 30% unless you're at a real panic because you haven't paid too much attention to your pressures or your temperatures and you really need to cool this thing down quick. However, the cowl shutters really cool this thing down really quickly. We'll go ahead and run them out to 100% and you can just watch those temperatures drop. So you don't need to run 100% hardly ever. Now that we've got a little bit of that out of the way, we'll come around, do a brake turn into a downwind base, and then our final for our landing. This aircraft is very stable, and it's a real easy plane to land. The brakes are effective, but they're not over effective, so you don't have to worry about nosing the plane under or nosing the plane over and prop striking under full braking. You don't have to worry about locking the wheels up. And you don't have to worry really about the thing doing a ground loop because you applied too much brake pressure in one section or the other, or one side or the other. And chop our throttle, do our turn into our downwind. All of the manuals for this aircraft indicate that you should not drop your landing gear above 170 miles per hour indicated, and your flaps should not be reduced, or your flaps should not be dropped at anything over 140 miles per hour. However, that's not exactly modeled accurately in this, or at least those warnings have a little bit of leeway to them, because I've been able to drop flaps and landing gear at over 200 miles per hour. Granted, I was slowing down through the whole process, but still. At 130 miles an hour, we're going to go ahead and turn to our final. Our approach speed is going to be about 120 miles an hour, with our final touchdown speed being somewhere around 100. We're going to go ahead and pull our pitch trim to 100%, and that is going to allow us to fly the aircraft with as little stick pressure as possible. If you have a curve like I do, that means that the control surfaces are most accurate, or at least they have the finest adjustments when the stick is near center. If you don't use your pitch trim and you're pulling all the way back on the stick in order to make your final run or your landing, you're going to have to adjust your elevators are going to have a little bit more authority. So if we come in, we're going to do our flare. That was a bit of a bounce. Holy cow. And full brakes. If the nose starts going to the right or to the left, simply lift off of that side's brakes a little bit. So you notice the nose started to go to the right on me a little bit, so I just left the left toe brake completely depressed and lifted off of the right toe brake a little bit, and that straightened it out. Don't use any rudder. That will get you into a ground loop quicker than you can think about it. And slowly exit the runway. This thing has a very small landing rollout if you get fully on the brakes in a 3-point position. Again, you don't have to worry about nosing it over with the brakes on full, and it's really easy to control if you don't over control it. So I hope you've all learned something valuable, and I hope you can enjoy the plane now. Future videos will talk about how to fly this plane in combat, because that's where it really gets interesting. Now, thanks for coming along for the ride. Thumbs up, like, comment, share the video if you want. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Salute. JG1 Barton out.